Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1196. Yes, we're progressing with some speed to 1200. We're looking forward to see what will be around the corner once we get there. I will continue with a nice article by Joachim Klause, and end it. It is time and temporality from Whitehead to quantum physics. And it's of course especially apt since we have the very good news. We are receiving 3 quantum physicists in Stockholm in December for the Nobel Prize. I think no one could be gladder. It is amazing news. Not far from an absolute miracle, I'd say. So we were into von Neumann. Von Neumann is important to understand to get into the concepts of Joachim Klause. And von Neumann was the one that showed that the observed event in the external world is directly linked to the brain of the observer of that event. The observed system, process 2, is described in terms of quantum mathematics. The observing system, process 1, in terms of human experiences. Due to the fact that it makes no practical difference which of the various placements of the dividing line between the two systems one uses, von Neumann put all parts of nature composed of atomic constituents on the side described in terms of the quantum mechanics, and only the consciousness of the observer outside of the mathematically described world. In von Neumann's formulation, the whole world is treated as a quantum system. He brought the physical and mental aspects of nature together as 2 aspects of a rationally coherent whole. Because his theory is built on Newtonian concept of an instant of time, it was elevated by Tomonaga and Schwinger to a form compatible with the physical requirements of the theory of relativity. They constructed a relativistic quantum theory. The Tomonaga-Schwinger surface sigma does not differ significantly from the constant time surfaces of Newtonian physics. Contrary to the theory of relativity, there is a preferred sequence of instantaneous nows. Direct changes of a part of the surface of sigma cause indirect changes along the rest of the surface due to quantum entanglements. These indirect changes produce the faster than light effects. Thus, quantum theory reverts at a certain deep ontological level to the Newtonian idea of instantaneous action at a distance, while maintaining all of the empirical demands of the theory of relativity. Nonetheless, there must be a dynamic connection between mind and brain. The mind of the observer is obviously connected to what is going on in his brain, and in his choice of which question to put to nature influences his brain in ways controlled in principle by quantum laws. Asking a question about something is closely connected to focus one's attention on it. This connection can be found via the quantum Zeno effect, which shows how the choice and timing of questions can influence the course of events in the probe system. Physical principles do not specify which questions are posed to nature. This opens the logical possibility that our conscious thoughts could be entering into the mind-brain dynamics in a way reducible neither to purely mechanical effects governed by the Schrödinger equation of motion, nor to the random effects of nature's choices of outcomes. In general, our thoughts issue commands to attend to certain questions in the future. These directives supply the missing components of the quantum dynamics. They pose the particular questions that are put to nature. The point is that the occurrence of a conscious thought associated with the quantum system is supposed to cause a reduction of the state of that system to the reduced state. Since the question to be posed is supposed to be an experience, it would appear that it really ought to be part of the mental rather than the physical side of the mind-brain dynamics. Quantum theory has a lacuna that can very naturally be filled in such a way as to allow our thoughts to exercise real, though not absolute, control over the mechanical aspects of mind-brain dynamics. Process philosophy and quantum ontology. The natural ontology for quantum theory has close similarities to key aspects of Whitehead's process and ontology. Both are theories of perception. Whitehead tells us that it is equally possible to arrive at his organic conception of the world from psychology on the one side and from mathematical physics on the other. Otherwise, quantum theory gives us a mathematical model, not an independent reality, but of our perception of reality. Both are interpreting systems of nature and share the same intention. On the other side, all Whiteheadian physicists have in mind a discussion of a modified philosophy of organism, which would preserve Whitehead's essential ideas while according with the discoveries of modern physics. There seem to be great differences deeply rooted in the concept of time. Spatially separated parts of reality must be related in some way that goes beyond the familiar idea that causal connections propagate only into the forward light cone. Quantum events behave as a unified system. Whitehead has been blamed for having only a causal theory of perception with which he cannot account for contemporary events. Actually, Whitehead introduces 3 different concepts of contemporaneity. contemporaneity, simultaneity, and instantaneity. An instantaneous space is static, being related to the static nature at an instant. Actual entities are called contemporary when neither belongs to the given actual world defined by the other. This concept covers all events in the light cone. But simultaneity includes all contiguous events of prehension. These events need not to be causally connected. Two electrons very distant from one another are also contiguous by means of gravity. Prehensions grow together to new actual locations if they fit to each other. This means if they pass in a coherence. Process philosophy can also cover the results of John Bell and Neumann, Tomonaga, Schwinger, that the available information about a system can be affected by a faraway observation. For Whitehead, the available information about the faraway system, which is disturbed by the nearby measurement, and the nearby system are one actual occasion. There is no need to modify process philosophy at this point. Einstein adopted the absence of absolute motion as one of the key postulates of special theory of relativity. This resulted in an ontology that the phenomenon of time was essentially an inseparable aspect to space itself. That reality was an unchanging piece of geometry. In this ontology, there is no notion of change, becoming, nor of the experiential aspects of time. Space itself, in conjunction with the sensitized detector, has some role in the measurement procedure. Space turns out to be a dynamic system, not some passive piece of geometry. Parisi and Wu discovered that a formalism of stochastic systems underlies the functional formalism of Dirac and Feynman. Stochastic iterative systems have essentially time-lag properties. Why not abandon the underlying static of space-time, upon which quantum field theory is constructed, and keep only the stochastic iterative process? Time would no longer be modeled by some fundamentally different system, such as by geometry, but by a time-like process itself. If this model of reality is proved to be successful, then one could adopt the ontology that reality is mind-like, like Leibniz and Whitehead suggested. Does Whitehead's ontology contain an inconsistency due to the fact that the principle of separatedness of all realized regions will generally not be satisfied in his causally local and separable ontology. This would be true if his metaphysics were traced back only to the theory of relativity, if one did not take into account that his idea originates from a psychophilosophical discussion, and that his theory of prehension connects all locations of the contemporary world, and that the concrescence process selects positive prehensions. If one concluded that, then either the causal independence of simultaneous occasions or the distinctness of their concrescence processes would have to be abandoned in order to secure the separatedness of all realized regions. And one would have to answer two questions. What does causality mean? Likewise, what does separatedness mean? Causality is merely the way in which each instance of freedom takes into account the previous instances, as each of our experience refers back through memory to our own past and through perception to the world's past. According to quantum thinking and process philosophy, there is no backward in time causation. The basic properties of relativistic quantum theory emerge from a logically simple model of reality. In this model, there is a fundamental creative process by discrete steps. Each step is a creative act or event. Each event is associated with a definitive space-time location. The fundamental process is not local in character, but it generates local space-time patterns that have mathematical forms amenable to scientific studies. Quantum theory is formulated as an indeterministic theory. Each experimenter can choose freely which experiment he will perform. In addition, the result of the experiment is subject only to statistical requirements. These elements of freedom of choice on part of both human participants and nature herself lead to a picture of reality that gradually unfolds in response to choices that are not necessarily fixed by the prior physical part of reality alone. The central roles of these discrete choices makes quantum theory a theory of discrete events, rather than a theory of continuous evolution of locally conserved matter energy. The internal process of concrescence is not a spatiotemporal process, but the way in which the result of this internal process is made available to the external world is an atomic act. Continuity is rejected as a basic feature of the units of becoming, but in the succession of the units of becoming, what becomes is continuity. Additionally, if quantum theory is a theory of observation, what does the term observer mean? Physical instruments of measurement cannot be regarded as observers. They do not generate facts. One would come to a chain of observers. Where does this chain end? Several eminent scientists, von Neumann, London and Bauer, and Wigner, 1967, proposed that it terminates when an event becomes consciously perceived. Consciousness is regarded as the ultimate agency. According to Heisenberg, to the Heisenberg picture, each occurring event signalizes a transition of the possible to the actual. A becoming actual location receives past actual locations as potentials for ingression into its own development. The development is from one potentiality to actuality, and from actuality to potentiality. The potentials of past actual entities are interwoven into a unit by activity of the growing actual entity. The newly grown actual entity is a real potential for future concrescence processes. There are parallels in quantum theory and psychology. Henry Stapp's quantum theory of consciousness is based on Heisenberg's interpretation that reality is a sequence of collapses of wave functions. Stapp observes that this view is similar to William James's view of mental life as experienced sense objects. According to Stapp, the whole range of science, from atomic physics to mind-brain dynamics, is brought together in a single coherent theory of an evolving cosmos consisting of a physical reality with the closely related but differently constituted mental aspects of nature. Is it now justified to argue that quantum events could be counted as sentient? This assertion would equip elementary quantum events with a degree of creativity. It must first be asked how mentality is to be measured. One observes mentality concerning its effect after the behavior of the things observed. To argue that each actual location possesses a mental pole is a consequence of the transference of human understanding to all events of nature. It conforms to the principle of unity in nature. Finally, quantum theory of consciousness, as well as a process philosophy, delivers a rationally coherent way of understanding our conscious selves within the reality surrounding and sustaining us. Whiteheadian quantum ontology is essentially an ontologization of the structure of orthodox relativistic quantum field theory, stripped of any anthropocentric formulations. This means that mentality is no longer served for human beings and higher creatures, but it is to a high degree anthropomorphical, because this is the only way we can speak about reality. Thus, Whitehead's philosophy of organism is a logical transfer of the concepts of human experience onto all entities of reality. In describing the last units of reality, he uses concepts which were derived from living organisms and applies them to the whole of nature. Why is consciousness needed in the universe at all? Because otherwise there would be no historical development. There were many possible changes from one state to another, but no becoming anew. This leads to a many minds interpretation. The absurd particularity would be the particularity of one individually observed branch of the universe. In this view, it is a property of each human consciousness to accommodate only a single one of these branches, even though all the branches exist together. The proposal of Heisenberg and Dirac, as well as our human understanding, asserts the opposite. Nature actualizes one observable branch from among the emergent set of possible ones. The conflict originates from the continuous character of the description of nature provided by the quantum state and the discrete character of human experience. Real becoming necessitates temporal atomicity, but real temporality presupposes teleology and consequently mentality. So we delved a little bit larger into the quantum physical description of Alfred North Whitehead. He shows clearly that there is a way of understanding these difficulties by looking much deeper into what time is, and that time actually has a duration. It is not a single point, which is assumed, but I would say very short to everyone these days. So if continue with the add-on here, I want to compare embodied cognition, because we're talking about thinking and the brain, but that understanding, as we know from Robert Pfeiffer, the Swiss engineer, that showed that everything is contained in the movement. All understanding is in the fractality of movement. And he's the guy who made the robots that learn from movement without having a central processing unit, any memory in the way of something inscribed in its circuits or in cell memory. No, it's the movement. And this is a process theory that Whitehead explained and put to the course. And to understand that there are processes that understand, not something static on the side of the subject, is incredibly important. And how we are bodily moving us determines our level of knowledge, awareness, and understanding. A little pointer here, or a teaser, there could actually be a conscious way of collapsing the superposition, but that means that you have to access awareness. Newtonian classical physics does not allow awareness. It is an unconscious process, it's a repetition, and it is a reduction of understanding. The article is written by Andrew D. Wilson and Sabrina Golonka. Embodied cognition is not what you think it is. I start with a little abstract here. The most exciting hypothesis in cognitive science right now is the theory that cognition is embodied. Like all good ideas in cognitive science, however, embodiment immediately came to mean 6 different things. The most common definitions involve the straightforward claim that states of the body modify states of the mind. However, the implications of embodiment are actually much more radical than this. If cognition can span the brain, body, and the environment, then the states of mind of disembodied cognitive science won't exist to be modified. Cognition will instead be an extended system assembled from a broad array of resources. Taking embodiment seriously therefore requires both new methods and theories. Here we outline 4 key steps that research programs should follow in order to fully engage with the implications of embodiment. The first step is to conduct a task analysis, which characterizes from a first-person perspective the specific task that a perceiving, acting cognitive agent is faced with. The second step is to identify the task-relevant resources the agent has access to in order to solve the task. These resources can span brain, body, and environment. The third step is to identify how the agent can assemble these resources into a system capable of solving the problem at hand. The last step is to test the agent's performance to confirm that agent is actually using the solution identified in step 3. We explore these steps in more detail with a reference to 2 useful examples, the outfielder problem and the A not B error, and introduced how to apply this analysis to the thorny question of language use. Embodied cognition is more than we think it is, and we have the tools we need to realize its full potential. The most exciting idea in cognitive science right now is the theory that cognition is embodied. It is, in fact, one of the things interested lay people know about cognitive science, thanks to many recent high-profile experiments. These experiments claim to show how cognition can be influenced and biased by states of the body. 2, that abstract cognitive states are grounded in states of the body, and using the former affects the later. The problem, however, is that this is not really what embodied cognition is about. Embodiment is the surprisingly radical hypothesis that the brain is not the sole cognitive resource we have available to us to solve problems. Our bodies and their perceptually guided motions through the world do much of the work required to achieve our goals, replacing the need for complex internal representation. This simple fact utterly changes our idea of what cognition involves, and thus embodiment is not simply another factor acting on an otherwise disembodied cognitive process. Many cognitive scientists see this claim occupying the extreme end of an embodiment continuum, and are happy with the notion that there can be many coexisting notions of embodiment, maybe 3 or even 6. Why rule out research programs that seem to be showing result? Why not have one strand of embodied cognition research that focuses on how cognition can be biased by states of the body, and another strand that focuses on the brain-body environment cognitive systems? The issue is that the former type of research does not follow through on the necessary consequences of allowing cognition to involve more than the brain. These consequences, we will argue, lead inevitably to a radical shift in our understanding of what cognitive behavior is made from. This shift will take cognitive science away from tweaking underlying competences and toward understanding how our behavior emerges from the real-time interplay of task-specific resources distributed across the brain, body, and environment, coupled together via our perceptual systems. This paper will proceed as follows. After laying out the standard cognitive psychological approach to explaining behavior, we'll briefly point to some interesting lines of empirical research from robotics and animal cognition that support the stronger replacement hypothesis of embodied cognition. We'll then lay out a recommended research strategy based on this work. Specifically, we will detail how to use a task analysis to identify the cognitive requirements of a task and the resources in brain, body, and environment available to fill these requirements. According to this analysis, it is the job of an empirical research program to find out which of the available resources the organism is actually using and how they have been assembled, coordinated, and controlled into a smart, task-specific device for solving the problem at hand. We'll focus on two classical examples in detail. The outfielder problem and the A not B task. We'll then contrast this task-specific approach with some embodied cognition research in the standard cognitive psychology mold and see how this latter research fails to successfully motivate any role for the body or environment, let alone the identified in the research. Finally, we'll conclude with some thoughts on how to begin to apply this approach to one of the harder problems in cognitive science, specifically language use. Language is the traditional bête noire of this more radical flavor of embodiment. And our goal in this final section will be to demonstrate that with a little work, a truly embodied analysis of language can, in fact, get off the ground. Standard cognitive explanations for behavior. We'll then contrast this task-specific approach with some embodied cognition research. And this is the standard cognitive explanations for behavior. Wow, look at that. So the segue I'm doing here is the brain in Henry Stapp, or consciousness in Whitehead, needs to be explained further, because by fiat I cannot change reality. And the complexity of the subject pool is not less than the objective pool, even if it's the whole universe. Standard cognitive explanations for behavior. The insight of early cognitive psychologists was that our behavior appears to be mediated by something internal to the organism. The classical example is Chomsky's critique of verbal behavior, in which he argues that language learning and use cannot be explained without invoking mental structures. In this case, innate linguistic capabilities. In general, the theoretical entities cognitive psychologists invoke to do this internal mediation are mental representations. At the time these ideas were taking off, research on perception suggested that our perceptual access to the world wasn't very good. This creates the following central problem for representations to solve. Listen to this. The brain is locked away inside our heads with only the impoverished, probabilistic, perceptual access to the world. But it has the responsibility of coordinating rapid, functional, and successful behavior in a dynamic, physical, and social environment. Because perception is assumed to be flawed, it is not considered a central resource for solving tasks. Because we only have access to the environment via perception, the environment also is not considered as central resource. This places the burden entirely on the brain to act as a storehouse for skills and information that can be rapidly accessed, parameterized, and implemented on the basis of the brain's best guess as to what is required, a guess that is made using some optimized combination of sensory input and internally represented knowledge. This job description makes the content of internal cognitive representations the most important determinant of the structure of our behavior. Cognitive science is, therefore, in the business of identifying this content and how it's accessed and used. Advances in perception research, particularly Gibson's work on direct perception, changes the nature of the problem facing the organism. Perception is not critically flawed. In fact, we have extremely high quality, direct perceptual access to the world. This means that perception, and by extension, the environment, can be a useful resource rather than a problem to be overcome by cognitive enrichment. Embodied cognition in any form is about acknowledging the role perception, action, and the environment can now play. A radical conclusion emerges from taking all this seriously. If perception-action couplings and resources distributed over brain, body, and environment are substantial participants in cognition, then the need for specific objects and processes of standard cognitive psychology, concepts, internally represented competence and knowledge, goes away to be replaced by very different objects and processes. Most commonly, perception-action couplings forming non-linear dynamical systems. This, in a nutshell, is the version of embodiment that Shapiro refers to as the replacement hypothesis. And our argument here is that this hypothesis is inevitable once you allow the body and environment into the cognitive mix. If such replacement is viable, then any research that keeps the standard assumptions of cognitive psychology and simply allows a state of the body to tweak cognition misses the point. To earn the name embodied cognition, research must, we argue, look very different from this standard approach. Embodied cognition, 4 key questions. The core question in psychology is, why does a given behavior have the form that it does? The standard cognitive psychology explanation for the form of behavior is that it reflects the contents and operation of an internal algorithm, often implemented as a mental representation designed to produce that behavior on demand. The work discussed below replaces complex internal control structures with carefully built bodies perceptually coupled to specific environments. Of course, embodied cognition solutions will also sometimes require internal control structures. Critically, though, these internal control structures are taking part in the activity of distributed, perceptually coupled systems from which behavior emerges online, in real time, in a context. Thus, explicit representations of behavior or knowledge have no place in embodied solutions. To get a rigorous handle on this claim, we suggest that there are 4 key questions any embodied cognition research program must address. 1. What is the task to be solved? Embodied cognition solutions solve specific tasks, not general problems. So identifying how an organism produces a given behavior means accurately identifying the task it is trying to solve at the time. Taking things one task at a time opens up the possibility of smart solutions. Organisms using smart solutions solve particular problems using heuristics made possible by stable features of the task at hand, rather than general purpose rote devices which apply algorithms to solve the task. For common tasks, smart solutions are typically more efficient, more stable, and more economical than root solutions. 2. What are the resources that the organism has access to in order to solve the task? Embodied cognition implies that there are resources, plural, available to the organism. These resources include the brain, but also the body, the environment, and the relations between these things. A task analysis should include an exhaustive list of resources available that might contribute, beginning with those available via perception and action, and only hypothesizing more complex cognitive resources once the capabilities of these other resources have been exhausted. An exhaustive list is possible if you are able to characterize your task formally. Tasks are differentiated from each other in terms of their underlying dynamics, and thus it is becoming common practice to formalize the task description using the tools of dynamical system. 3. How can these resources be assembled so as to solve the task? Solving a specific task means creating a smart, task-specific device that can do the job. To be more specific, it means assembling the required resources into a dynamical system that solves the task at hand as its behavior unfolds over time. Remember, these resources can be distributed over brain, body, and environment. Since we only have access to information about our bodies and the environment via perception, an embodied analysis must include a detailed account of the perceptual information used to connect the various resources. 4. Does the organism in fact assemble and use these resources? It is always an empirical question whether the dynamical system hypothesized in step 3 is in fact an accurate description of the system the organism has assembled to solve the task. The basic experimental tool for establishing the identity of a dynamical system is the perturbation experiment. Systems respond to perturbations of resources in a manner that is specific to the role that resource plays in the system. This allows you to map the composition and organization of the system at hand. The next sections will review what this new research looks like in practice. We will begin with some simpler cases that tackle and clarify some of the key questions, and end up with 2 cases of human behavior that demonstrate how to tie these 4 questions into a coherent research program. Embodiment in action. Embodiment in action 1. Robots. One of the most productive areas to demonstrate the strength of the replacement hypothesis is robotics. Robots built on the principles of embodiment are capable of interestingly complex behavior, demonstrating how far you can get without representational enrichment. When you build something yourself from scratch, you know exactly what is and is not included in the control system. This means that your pool of potential explanations for a given behavior is constrained and enumerated, and you can answer questions 2 and 3 in great detail. Swiss robots. I know this was coming. An early example of embodied cognition robotics comes from Marie et Bokhorst, who built small DIDA-bots with infrared detectors placed around their bodies and a very simple internal control structure, a single rule: turn away from the detected obstacle. In this paper, the detector at the front of the robot was deactivated. The robot could no longer see anything directly ahead, but it could see off to the sides and behind. If it hit an obstacle, a white block head-on, it simply kept moving and pushed the block along until it turned to avoid the next obstacle. The first block was then left behind, and the net result was that the randomly scattered blocks were tidied up into heaps. This tidying behavior is not specified in the control structure of robots. It emerges in real time from the relationship between the rule, the environment, the presence or absence of other robots, and, importantly, the bodies of the robots. Importantly then, the robots are not actually tidying, they are only trying to avoid obstacles. And their errors in a specific, extended, embodied context leads to a certain stable outcome that looks like tidying. This is Pfeiffer. Understanding the resources the robots had available and how they were organized was what enabled the researchers to identify that the robots were not, in fact, trying to tidy anything up. Locomotion and passive dynamics. Why does walking have the form that it does? One explanation is that we have internal algorithms which control the timing and the magnitude of our strides. Another explanation is that the form of walking depends on how we are built and the relationship between that design and the environments we move through. Considering the resources available to solve this task highlights the centrality of an organism's design. Humans don't walk like lions because our bodies aren't designed like lions' bodies. The properties of our design are referred to as passive dynamics. How are the segments arranged? How are they connected to each other? How springy are the connections? Robotics work on the walking show that you can get very far in explaining why walking has a particular form just by considering the passive dynamics. For example, robots with no motors or onboard control algorithms can reproduce human gait patterns and levels of efficiency simply by being assembled correctly. Work at the MIT has added simple control algorithms to this kind of system, which allows the robots to maintain posture and control propulsion more independently. The same algorithm can produce a wide variety of locomotion behaviors, depending on which robotic body they control. None of these systems include a representation of the final form of their locomotion. This form emerges in real time and from the interaction of the passive dynamics with the environment during the act of moving. These robots demonstrates how organisms might use distributed task resources to replace complex internal control structures. Robot crickets. A fascinating example of embodiment in nature has been replicated in the lab in the form of a robot. For the more detailed analysis of this case that we drew from here, look at Barrett 2011. Female crickets need to find male crickets to breed with. Females prefer to breed with males who produce the loudest songs. This means that the task facing female crickets is to find the males who sing the loudest. What resources do they use to solve this problem? Female crickets have a pair of air drums, one on each front leg, which are connected to each other via a tube. Sound entering from the side activates that side's eardrum directly and also travel through the tube from the other eardrum as well. These signals are out of phase if the sound is off to one side, and this increases the amplitude of that side's eardrum response. This arrangement is therefore directional. This explains how the female can tell what direction a sound is coming from, but it doesn't explain how she uses this information to move forward toward this sound, or how she manages to tune into crickets of her own species. If so happens that the eardrums connect to a small number of interneurons that control turning, female crickets always turn in the direction specified by the more active interneuron. Within a species of cricket, these interneurons have a typical activation decay rate. This means that the pattern of activation is maximized by sounds with a particular frequencies. Male cricket songs are tuned to this frequency, and the net result is that with no explicit computation or comparison required, the female cricket can orient toward the male of her own species, producing the loudest song. The analysis of task resources indicates that the cricket solves the problem by having a particular body. This is very important. It fits like a lock into a key, or vice versa. Eardrum configuration and interneuron connections. And by living in a particular environment where male crickets have songs of particular frequencies. Webb have built robots that only have these basic capacities. And these robots successfully reproduce the form of a female cricket's exploratory behavior. The robots have no stored information about the male cricket songs and simply perceive and act using a particular arranged body. It is clear that the robot doesn't explicitly implement choosing the male with the strongest song. Finding him is simply the result of this embodied strategy operating in the context of multiple male crickets singing, and is driven by the onset of the chirps within the song. The success of this work results from carefully analyzing the task at hand, identifying available resources, and specifying how these resources are assembled by the agent. And these are questions 1 to 3 that I outlined before. Summary of this part so far. This robotics work, and more like it, reveal a great deal of complex behavior, from tidying to locomotion to mate selection, can emerge from placing the right type of body into a specific environmental context, without any explicit representation of the form of that behavior anywhere in the system. This work is a proof of concept that embodiment and embedding can therefore replace internal algorithms and lead to stable functional behavior. Sorry for the pause here, it's way too interesting. But I think you can see how also in quantum physics it's key and lock situation. The cricket in their structure, how they are built and how they move, understands. And now we're not using representation. The understanding is in the movement. And this is maybe the clearest explanation of what a movement is. It's an easy word just to say movement, but it's a bit more to it. Embodiment in action. 2. Animals. The robot work is fascinating, is one part of a strong argument in favor of the replacement hypothesis. Of course, the next critical step is to establish whether biological organisms actually take advantage of these embodied solutions. And this is question 4. Or whether they follow a different, more computational path. Crickets again. Webb's robot crickets implement a simple embodied perception action strategy to perform male selection. A hypothesis that follows from this work is that females use the onset of a male song to drive exploration, rather than attending to the entire song and choosing the best one. Observation of real crickets shows that female crickets do indeed move before they could possibly have processed an entire song. Supporting this embodied chirp onset hypothesis. For an overview, you can look at Heidegger and Webb 2005 and Barron 2011. Those I can recommend. Swarming, herding, hunting. Many animals produce carefully coordinated activities with large numbers of conspecifics. Forming large groups, swarms, herds or flocks is a valuable defense against predators, and maintaining these groups require ongoing coordination across many individuals. This coordination is not centrally controlled, however, and is not a result of an explicit attempt to maintain a swarm. Instead, the coordination emerges from and is maintained by the operation of straightforward perception-action coupling rules in a suitable context. Bird flocking is elegantly explained as a coupling between individuals constrained by 3 principles. 1. Separation, that is, avoid crowding neighbors. 2. Alignment, stir toward average heading of neighbors. And 3. Cohesion, stir toward average position of neighbors. Interestingly, cohesion exhibits asymmetries that relate to the perceptual capabilities of birds. The average position is the center of mass of only the nearest 5 to 10 birds. weighed in favor of birds off to the side, reflecting the field of view for the bird vision. Sheep herding is similarly straightforward. Sheep head for the geometric center of the flock when a predator approaches, implementing a selfish herd strategy without any individual in the herd being selfish per se. A more complex example of coordinated social activity is the pack hunting of wolves. The pattern of their activity, however, is readily explained by two simple rules. One, move toward the prey until a minimum safe distance is reached, and then two, move away from any other wolves that are also close to the prey. No leader is required, no instructions need to be given. The form of the group's hunting activity emerges from a simple perception-action coupling strategy implemented by each individual operating in a specific context. Continuing the hunting theme has an extended discussion on what she refers to the implausible nature of Portia, the jumping spider. Portia is capable of some remarkable feats: deceptive mimicry, creating diversions to distract prey, and taking extended detours in order to sneak up on dinner. This is a quote from Barrett, 2011. This last is especially impressive. Detours mean Portia must operate for extended periods without direct perceptual contact with its prey. This would seem to require some form of route planning. As Barrett notes, this hypothesis seemed initially plausible because of the way in which Portia scans its environment. Prior to taking the detour, it would sit and sway from side to side, seemingly evaluating potential routes and making a selection. However, this scanning behavior, coupled with the anatomy of the spider's eyes, is actually an embodied strategy that enables Portia to generate successful detours using currently available perception information. Portia is perceiving, she is not planning. Summary: the advantage of examples from the animal literature is that researchers are less likely to want to attribute performance to complex internal representations. However, once we identify that embodied, situated perception-action couplings can produce complex adaptive behavior in other animals, it becomes more difficult to deny the existence of such solutions in our own repertoire unless one wishes to deny the evolutionary continuity between ourselves and the rest of the animal kingdom. embodiment in action, people. We will now review in some detail two excellent examples of successful replacement style embodied cognition in psychology. These examples are the outfielder problem and the A not B error. For other uses of this example, look at Clark and Smith and Gasser 2005. They are useful because A, they address all four key questions of good embodiment research, and B, both examples have standard cognitive psychology explanations that have been successfully replaced after numerous studies implementing the kind of embodied approach we are advocating here. These sections will begin by describing the standard cognitive psychology explanations for the outfielder problem and the A not B error. We will then take a step back and analyze each task from an embodied cognition perspective, asking our four key questions. One, what is the task to be solved? Two, what are the resources that the organism has access to in order to solve the task? Three, how can these resources be assembled so as to solve the task? Four, does the organism in fact assemble and use these resources? Embodiment in action 3, the outfielder problem. How does a baseball outfielder catch a fly ball? There are many factors that make this task difficult. The fielder is far away from the batter, the ball is optically very small and remains so until it is very close to the fielder. The fielder has to move from their starting location to the location where the ball will land at some point in the future. They have to arrive at this location in time to intercept the ball. The standard explanation for this is that this is going to be interesting to have this mauled to pieces. The standard explanation. The initial hypothesis is that we can catch fly balls by predicting their future location based on the physics of the ball's motion. A fly ball is an instance of projectile motion, and the fixes of this kind of ballistic flight are relatively straightforward. For an object of a given size and mass, the primary variables that determine the flight are initial direction, velocity, and angle. Can you see the connection to Whitehead here? And Henry Stapp, of course. Plus some local constants such as drag, air density, and gravity. Suggest that the outfielders perceive these initial parameters and then use them as an input to an internal simulation representation of projectile motion. This representation allows outfielders to predict the future location of the ball, and this is called trajectory prediction. Once the future location of the ball has been predicted, the fielder can simply run to that location and wait. Yeah, sure. The embodied solution. Saxber in 87 and his solution assumes that the act of catching a fly ball is a lot like solving a physics problems, relying on some limited resources, the ball's initial conditions, for instance, and some internal simulation. In contrast, the embodied solution first asks if that's true by asking, what are the resources that are available in this task, and how might they help a person trying to catch a ball? A fielder stands in the outfield of a baseball diamond, around 70 to 80 meters from the home plate. The batter pops a fly ball into the air, and the fielder must locate from where they are to where the ball will be when it hits the ground. So the fielder's task is to move themselves so that they arrive at the right place at the right time to intercept a fly ball. Sometimes fielders are in a direct line with the flight of the ball, but the general problem to be solved involves the fielders being off to one side. What are the resources available? The first thing to note is that at the distances involved, the optical projection of the baseball is tiny. Any attempt to figure out how far away the ball is and where it's going using changes in the optical projection size will be riddled with errors, if it's possible at all. Something that Cutting, the guru of Ian McGilchrist, questioned. These errors would propagate through any simulation, which makes solutions based on computer simulations of projectile motion unstable. This means that the simulation solution is not a likely resource, and in fact, the evidence suggests it is not an option. What else is available? To identify the full range of available resources, we need to understand the physical properties of the fly ball event. Events unfold over time and are distinguished from one another by their underlying dynamics. Which describes both how the system changes over time and the forces which produce the change. In the present example, the relevant dynamics are that of a projectile motion. As a given example of the projectile motion dynamic plays out, it creates kinematic information which can be detected and used by an observer. Kinematic descriptions include only how the system changes over time and without reference to the underlying forces. Perceptual systems can only detect kinematic patterns, But observers actually want to know about the underlying dynamic event. This is the perceptual bottleneck. Kinematics can specify the underlying dynamics, however, and detecting a specifying kinematic pattern is equivalent to perceiving the underlying dynamic. The information that an outfielder might use to continuously guide their actions to the future position of the ball must therefore be kinematic and specific to the future position. Can you hear where this is going? The batter provides the initial conditions of the ball's trajectory, direction, velocity, and angle. And after that, the flight unfolds according to the dynamics of the projectile motion. This dynamic produces motion along a parabolic trajectory. The form of this motion is that the ball initially rises and decelerates until it reaches a peak height when its velocity reaches 0. It then accelerates as it falls down to the other side of the parabola. This motion is the kinematic information that is available to the observer. The fielder also brings resources with them. These include the ability to detect kinematic information and, most usefully, to locomate over a range of speeds along any trajectory across the fields. How might these resources be assembled to solve the task? How can the perceptual information specifying the dynamics of the fly ball be used in conjunction with the fielder's ability to perceive kinematics and locomote? The parabolic flight of the ball creates the possibility of two basic solutions. Each strategy requires the outfielder to move in a particular way so as to offset some aspect of the parabolic flight, either the acceleration or the curve of the path. If the fielder is able to successfully offset either the acceleration or the curve of the path, then they will end up in the right place in the right time to intercept the ball. When reading about these solutions in more detail below, notice that neither one requires the fielder to predict anything about the ball's future location, only to move in a particular way with respect to the ball's current motion. This is prospective control. The first solution is called optical acceleration cancellation and requires the fielder to align themselves with the path of the ball and run so to make the ball appear to move with constant velocity. The second strategy is called linear optical trajectory, LOT, and requires the fielder to move laterally so as to make the ball appear to trace a straight line. Which strategy is adopted depends on whether the fielder is relative to the ball. The optical acceleration cancellation, OAC, works best if the ball is coming straight for you. LOT always allows you to intercept the ball that is heading off to one side. So we are using motion and we do not need to infer anymore the calculation of the trajectory and the idea of the ball being a representation in our head, and we put it into the Cartesian coordinates, thereby predicting the parabola. And this is exactly the viewpoint of common people today and the viewpoint of classical physics. So interesting. Now, it shows clearly from neurology that is absolutely impossible. And now to the question. Does the organism in fact assemble and use these resources? The computational strategies suggest that the outfielder will run in a straight line to the predicting landing site. This is because the fielder computes the future landing site based on an input variables that the fielder detects before setting off. Since the shortest path to a known landing site in an open terrain is a straight line, the fielder should run directly to the place where they intercept the ball. Outfielders do not typically run in straight lines, ruling the computational strategy out. Lott and Oak predict either a curving path or one with a velocity profile that offsets the acceleration of the ball. The evidence generally favors LOT, but there is evidence that OAC is viable and utilized strategy under certain conditions. These solutions have numerous advantages over the computational solution. First, instead of relying on an initial estimate of the ball's motion, which could be in error, they allow the fielder to continuously couple themselves to the ball. This coupling provides fielders with numerous opportunities for error detection and correction. Second, the strategies provide a continuous stream of information about how well the fielder is doing. If the ball still seems to be accelerating, or if its trajectory is still curved, this tells the fielder both that there is an error and what to do to fix the error. If the fielder is running flat out and is still unable to correct the errors, this specifies an uncatchable ball, and the fielder should switch to intercepting the ball on the bounce instead. The affordance property, catchableness, is therefore continuously and directly specified by the visual information, with no internal simulation or prediction required. Summary. In both LOT and OAC, various task resources, the motion of the ball, the fielder, the relation between them specified by the kinematics of the ball viewed by the moving observer, have been assembled into a task-specific device to serve the task at hand, which is intercepting the projectile. This assembly is smart in the sense described by Runson. It takes advantage of certain local facts of matter to create a robust but task-specific solution. the most important lesson here is that the relation between perceptual information about the motion of the ball and an organism, the outfielder, replaces the need for an internal simulation of the physics of the projectile motion. Well, the most important lesson here is that the relation between perceptual information about the motion of the ball and the organism, the outfolder, replaces the need for internal simulation of the physics of the projectile motion. And I don't think it's too hard to see how this can be compared to physics. We no longer have any need for a representation. That is, in the lingua of classical physics, an object does no longer have any necessity. Actually, it's a redundancy. And it creates a whole mystical coverage of understanding. It makes understanding very tough to reach. So now we're going to the next paragraph. Embodiment in action 3.2, the A not B error. What do children know about objects and their properties? And when do they come to this knowledge? Piaget investigated this question by asking children of various ages to search for objects that were hidden behind some obstacle in view of the children. Prior to about 7 months, children simply don't go looking for the object, as if it has ceased to exist. From around 12 months, children will happily go and retrieve the hidden object, seemingly now understanding that even though they can't see the toy they want, it is still there to be found. In the transition, however, children make a rather unusual error. After successfully reaching several times for a hidden object at the first location A, they will then fail to reach for the hidden object at location B, even though the hiding happened in full view of the object. They will instead reach to A again, and this is why it's called A not B error. There are a variety of standard cognitive explanations for this error, but all in essence assume that A, the child that has developed the necessary object concept that includes the knowledge that objects persist even when they are out of view. B, there is something about the reaching that cannot tap that knowledge reliably. the child's underlying competence can demonstrate using looking behavior as a measure. For example, children look longer at displays showing the error trial, suggesting they know something is not right. The problem, therefore, is the reaching performance. Reaching cannot yet access the knowledge necessary. This performance competence distinction is a common theme in the cognitive development literature. It assumes that the goal of the science is to understand the core competence, and that to do so you must devise clever methods to bypass the potential limitations of performance. Thelen et al. 2001 challenged every single aspect of this account with their embodied dynamical systems model of the reaching task. This model was the end result of numerous experiments motivated by a rejection of the performance competence distinction and renewed focus on the details of the task at hand. As Thelen et al. Puts it, the A not B error is not about what infants have and don't have as enduring concepts, traits or deficits, but what they are doing and have done. See action processes coming in here. Welcome Whitehead. The end result was an account of the A not B error that replaces object knowledge and performance deficits with the dynamics of perceiving and acting over time in the context of reaching task. But what is the task to be solved? This is actually quite a complicated question. The canonical version of the task requires the infant to watch as an attractive toy is hidden at location. A. The child is then allowed to search for and retrieve the object several times, after which the object is hidden at location B, in the full sight of the baby. One of the inspirations for pursuing a dynamical system embodied approach here was that almost every parameter of this task is known to affect infants' performance. These parameters include the distance to the targets, the distinctiveness of the covers, the delay between hiding and search, what the infant is searching for, food or a toy, whether the infant is moved, and how much crawling experience they have. If the A not B error reflects object knowledge, why do these factors matter so much? To get a handle on this question, the first thing that Thelen et al. Did was to enumerate the details of the canonical task so that they had clear understanding of the available resources that might impact infants' performance. First, the infant gets continuous visual input from two wells in a box placed at a certain distance away from the child and apart from one another. The experimenter draws the infant's attention to the object and then hides the object in well A. This specific visual input indicates which well the reaching target is in. After a short delay, during which infants typically look at the cued location, they perform a visually guided reach to retrieve the object. This reach requires them to remember the location of the hidden object for the duration of the delay. This is repeated several times until the switch to the B location, at which the point the infant makes the error around 70 to 80% of the time. What are the resources available? In this version of the task, the resources that might impact performance include the details of the continuous and specific visual input, the length of the delay, and the delay's relationship to the temporal dynamics of the memory of the previous reaches. The infant also brings resources to the task. For instance, their performance depends on their ability to maintain visual attention and the way in which they perform visually guided reaches. Tiernan et al. Do not include an object concept as a resource. The purpose of this seeming omission is to see how well they can model the behavior without invoking any core competence separate from the observed performance. My conclusion here is we have getting into the neurological part, the biological part of what is a quantum observer. And normally, as was the case in cognition science and neurology unto the event of the turn of the millennia, was to assume the classical model of an outside world. And motion was never ever a part of understanding. A process model of Whitehead quantum mechanics shows that there is a motion. Reality itself is a motion, whereas objects are abstractions. They are not even solid abstraction. They lack the permanence as a movement can have. This goes to show objects will not be good givers of knowledge. We can't use them to catch a flying ball. A fly ball cannot be caught by a person that is locked up in classical physics. And I think that goes to show also, obviously, classical physics is not a very valid or helpful description of the world. And I think especially those cases coming from Ian McGilchrist, where people suffering from autism and schizophrenia, things that has come up almost simultaneous as the event of Newtonian classical physics, are suffering from object fixation. Especially one interview touched my heart. A young girl described how she planned. She used different scenarios that were like stable object-like things, and she weighed them. Should I go to church tomorrow, or should I go shop? Which way she should go, and how she sort of weighed them. That was nothing like scary, and it's not hard to understand that nothing in her life worked, as it most usually doesn't do for autistic people. Their movement is not of the kind that give them information for them to understand. This has been an object for a lot of research the last couple of decades. So here we see neurology slowly crawling, I have to use that term, closer to neurology and quantum mechanics. Classical physics is a special mode of putting your cognitive awareness and the lack of information, the lack of knowledge, the randomness in your understanding of the world. This is what classical physics is for the normal person. And this is why quantum mechanics is the only savior of perception, thinking, and prediction. So clearly shown here. I'll just not forget to put a mark, and I continue in the next lecture. I mean, this was a long-winded one. Please have a very nice afternoon, and goodbye for now.